Good morning, y'all. Such a peaceful place to be, isn't it? I just feel so calm when I come here. Wow. Okay. I I don't know why I decided to talk about surrender. And I think it has to do with after I finished this, I said, why am I even doing this? Why am I talking about surrender? And it struck me that there's so much uncertainty in the world right now on every level and every plane. And I think is kind of can be a bit unnerving at times because, we just don't know what's going on. So what can we do? Surrender. That's about it. That's about all we can do. Um, when we get insight into surrender, to me, it usually starts, well, I really don't know of any time that when a person gains real insight into surrender, that it didn't come as a result of some kind of personal experience that kind of shook them to the foundation and realizing that surrender was the only solution. And usually it seems to me that experience that gains insight into surrender, it's not real pretty. It's usually just not real pretty. It's usually kind of ugly. And at least at the time, at the moment, that's when it is. I can remember the first time that I really was rattled and shaken by the whole concept of surrender. And it was when I was in Pueblo, Colorado. I'd spent 5 years on an Indian reservation. And during that 5 years, I was just sapped to the bone. I was trying to turn a mission into a parish, and I was already using drugs, alcohol, and pot. And when I got to the mission, there was so much addiction around me. The previous priest that had been there had collapsed into addiction. Didn't make it through, but and I ran into the same thing. And as a result, I needed to go to treatment to get myself straightened out. Had run into lots of financial issues. I realized that the big crunch of the whole thing was through this, I became fully aware that I needed to leave priesthood, that this was not where I needed to be anymore. Not that I absolutely had loved the previous 10 years. I'd done a good job. I'd busted my chops on the reservation to a point that was just insanity, where there was so much dysfunction, people didn't have a place to sleep. And so the Red Cross put cots out in the parish hall. But sometimes I would get drunk and forget to lock the door between the hall and my apartment. So I'd wake up the next morning and there'd be bodies all over the floor. And I just have to tiptoe over everybody and get to the kitchen. And that was just my life. I had a very interesting experience where a woman intervened that worked for the Catholic Crosswinds, which was the newspaper. She had heard the work that I'd been doing out there. She came out to write an article. And when she saw what she saw, she realized I was going to crash and burn. And so she grabbed the phone, and I remember one time just shoving it into my head when my head was just going like this with the phone. She says, "Call the bishop now. I won't do it. Call him." And I didn't. And as a result, my life just started falling apart. I remember being so stupid. A bunch of kids came over one time and said, "Oh, so-and-so over here, he's got a job in Durango and his car broke down." And so we pooled what things we had and we wanted to go hawk them. But we have to be 18 and some of us are not. Would you go help us out? And some of them were tools that I went, well, yeah, sure. So what was going on? Anybody with 3 brain cells together? What was going on? Yeah, they stole the tools, right? Duh. So they're going to hawk them, and I was helping them. So I got charged with contributing to delinquency. And, you know, it was just one thing after another was telling me, you've done this, it's finished, move on. And that was tearing me apart. I could remember laying outside on the ground in November at 11 o'clock at night with nothing but with a t-shirt. That's it, just a t-shirt. And I couldn't feel the cold because I was completely and utterly numb. I realized I was completely spiritually barren as well. I couldn't pray. Nothing would rise up. And in that utter deadness within, these words just came out as if God were praying to himself through me. And the words that came through were, God, do whatever you need to do with me to make me into the person that you most want me to become. And when those words came through, I suddenly relaxed and felt peace that I hadn't felt for a long, long time. And that prayer became part of my daily life after that. And shortly after that prayer came through, I mean, I'm talking about shortly as in minutes, I saw a vision. It's the only time I've ever seen a vision in my whole life. And it wasn't like, whoosh, like this, it was more awareness from within. And in that vision, I saw myself in 3 situations that were all possible. And one of them was I saw myself in jail. And I was happy. It was strange. Here I was happy in jail. I thought, that's great. How about that? You know, And another one, I saw myself back in a parish working, and I was happy. Imagine that. And then another one came along that I had no clue what it was. I saw, like as an aerial view down, this big fancy place in a large field, big building, really nice, that I thought was a retreat center. And off to the side was this garage apartment. And in the vision, I was living in the garage apartment. And I didn't know what it was or what I was doing or anything. I kind of got the idea that it was a monastery, and I was like what do they call those guys? A guy that greets people and lets them in. One of those guys that greets people and lets them in guy. And blah, 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 blah. Anyway, strangely enough, 2 years later, I had gone back to Oklahoma and after I'd finished treatment, and I decided to do what I really knew I was being led to do, and that was to become a drug and alcohol counselor. And I went to my very first job in this place in Cushing, Oklahoma. Never been there before. I mean, all kinds of things clarified to me that that was the right thing to do. I found out that I knew that my mother was raised there in Cushing, but I'd never been there. I went there and rented a place. And then a couple of years later, I bought a place. I bought the house my mother was raised in, completely accidentally. So, you know, God was clarifying that I was on the right path at that point. But the one thing that made it real clear is when I drove to this place called Cushing Valley Hope, it was the place I saw in my vision to a T. It was that fancy house that had been a mansion that had later been turned into a Jesuit retreat center and later had been turned into Cushing Valley Hope. And the garage apartment, that's where I ended up living for the first 6 months off to the side, precisely and identically as I saw it. And it was, but going back to that vision, it wasn't but a few days after that, I had the only prophetic dream I had ever had in my life, still to this day. And it was powerful, it was intense. The dream was that I was on a dock going out into water, into the ocean, it seemed like, or a very big body of water. And my friends from Western Colorado, from Durango and Bayfield, had gathered with me on that dock. And I had my suitcase with me, and it was wide open. And in the suitcase were all the things that had to do with my life professionally, papers, certificates, this, that, and the other. And the next thing you know, a big breeze comes along and blows every bit of that stuff out of the suitcase out into the air and into the water. And I panicked and I jumped up with all my clothes and my shoes and I dove into the water and began swimming real fast to recapture everything from my priesthood ministry, but it was sinking. And so I had to dive deeper and deeper and deeper to collect it and to grab it, what pieces I could. And I was grabbing papers and shoving them in my pockets. And then all of a sudden, right in front of me, I saw this big golden colored fish. And I said, well, that's one of those goldfish that turns into a carp. And it just struck me, oh, how interesting. So I swam back up to the surface, and on the surface there was a piece of paper floating, and on it was an old-fashioned key. And I realized that I had to grab that key and keep it because that was going to open up my future. So I did. And I kept swimming and kept swimming, and it was in the opposite way of the dock. And I realized at that point, the water started congealing into land. It was real strange. And just becoming little chunks of land until eventually it was solid land. And it was this beautiful beach. It was very warm and peaceful. And I pulled out of the water and something told me, it said, you'll never go back there again. And it was kind of heartbreaking because that's, you know, it was 10 years of my life and I loved it. I later came to realize what that meant, that I dove into the water fully and completely with all my clothes and my shoes. It was telling me that I needed to completely and totally surrender. That I couldn't hold anything back. Everything was going to change. And this is interesting. A few months after I had that dream, I began my treatment in drug and alcohol treatment in Atlanta, which is how I got here, by the way. Just while I was in treatment, I would come up here and go camping, and I fell in love with the place. And then, so I started coming out after that every summer and ended up out here. But when I drove into the treatment center for the first time, you know, and at this point, this dream was still pretty intense in my head. It was a very short period of time between the two. And you remember the fish that I saw? Right on the side of the building were 4 letters. CARP. And I realized that it was an acronym for Comprehensive Addiction Rehabilitation Program. But it told me at the time, this is where you're supposed to be. Because of all these experiences, which I still haven't completely figured out, it took me on or began a lifelong study, a lifelong search into the meaning of surrender. What does it really mean? To my knowledge, every sincere path of spirituality honors the central importance of surrender. All of them say this is the core. This includes Islam with the whirling dervishes that, you know, spin and spin and spin to bring themselves into a state of surrender. African shaman who seek surrender to the spirit that they wish to move through them and empower them. And of course, that is surrender. I think of the Hindu Yoga Sutra, where Patanjali describes a spiritual observance that he literally called surrender to the Lord, which he said was the fastest way to an inner state of oneness that he considers to be the true goal of all the yogis. He says, okay, you can get there without surrender, but it's going to take you a long time and many lifetimes. He said that surrender was the express train to that state of utter oneness and peace that he said, really, you can't find any other way. And Christian mysticism, and that's what I've always identified with, is completely based on surrender. I'll share with you a couple of Bible passages that to me make sense. Matthew 16:25 is where Yeshua speaks out, speaking about surrender of the ego. It sounds like he's talking about martyrdom. But when you dig deeper and look at what everything, he's not talking about martyrdom, I'm talking about killing yourself. He's talking about surrender. And he says, for whoever will save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, they will gain it. And you're going, yeah, you know what he means. If I give up that which is my ego, which is my false self, if I surrender that self and allow it to die, that's where I regain my life completely. And Paul digs into that big time later on. On the Sermon on the Mount, in chapter 6, he says, look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store into barns. And yet your heavenly Father feeds each one of them. Or consider the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin. Yet even Solomon in all of his glory was not clothed like one of these. Can any one of you, by worrying about it, add a single hour to your life? You say, surrender it, let it go. That's one of the reasons I love to walk in the woods so much. That's one of the reasons I love it so dearly, is I'm surrounded by all the things that have surrendered. They're completely one with the divine. They're not scheming to try to create anything like we do. They've just utterly surrendered to what is real and what is eternal. I was watching an Oprah special where it was just called Belief, that describes practices of surrender from various faiths. And one of them that I'll never forget that struck me really powerfully was a segment on the initiation of a Jain nun, Jain nun. And it's a segment of Hinduism. And she has to renounce everything. She has to renounce her parents. Her parents are there. And she has to tell them goodbye, and they can never speak to her ever again, and they can never touch her ever again. And part of the ceremony is she has each one of her hairs pulled out by the roots, so she leaves bald. When males do this initiation, they do exactly the same thing, every detail, except they must take off all of their clothes into utter nudity and spend the rest of their lives walking through the streets completely naked, with nothing, no possessions of any kind. Whatever they eat, whatever they need, must be given to them by someone who cares. You know, it's kind of weird. I did that for 2 years. That's another talk. But 2 years just hitchhiked with nothing. And I was given a dime when I left this one place and spent the rest of the 2 years hitchhiking with nothing. And I never one time, ever once, missed a meal, never one time lacked anything that I needed. If surrender happens, you will receive, you are utterly empowered. So I look at these Jain nuns and monks and I go, am I really ready to surrender? Good question. And if surrender is so central to spiritual growth, then why do we resist it so much? If it's the key to entering into a life where you have everything you could possibly need and never need to worry, why do we put it aside? And I think one reason is that we tend to confuse the spiritual process of surrender with giving up. Or we may believe that letting go is a synonym to doing nothing and just letting other people have their way over us. Well, if that was it, I wouldn't do it either. And this can be particularly hard for people who have been abused in the past, and they struggle with control because when they were young, they had no control and they were taken advantage of. So they felt later that they needed to maintain control. It's particularly difficult for them. But if I surrender, it is not me yielding to lack of action or surrendering to a person. Surrender, spiritual surrender, is always about yielding to a higher, deeper will, to a source, a power in it that is life of itself. It starts with recognizing that the Creator has chosen to move through you as you. You don't lose your real self. The Creator doesn't take it away, as far as I'm concerned. Some will disagree with me, but I think the Creator created you as you and is choosing to live through you as you. There's nothing being taken away. There's nothing to fear. It is utterly and truly empowering. People look at it and think my power will be taken away. The opposite is true. You are empowered. It requires a shift of your sense of what the I means. You have to redefine what that I means in order to be able to surrender, which is why searching for the answer to the question, who am I, is really pretty important. It's central to spiritual growth. It's about letting go of the false self, which is identified with fear and greed. And you know what I'm talking about, personal importance and all our defenses and all our worries. Lots of people take their ego to be the only self that there is. We've talked about this a bunch of times. And life ends up lost in competition and lost in loneliness because it's always me against everyone else. So I'm separated from all people. So if the ego puts me in a separation with everything else, what does surrender do? Any clues? It brings me into unity and in bond with everybody else because I'm no longer struggling to gain, to get. I know that everything I need is going to be provided for me. Freedom. Yeah, there you go. Total and complete freedom. Yeah, as a matter of fact, my last line is allowing this to happen is your key to complete freedom. Thank you, Miss Bonnie. But surrender is not something that you can make happen all at once, because literally the little I isn't capable of dropping its own grasp on control. That little I, that ego, isn't capable of letting go of itself. It takes something else to work. I would say letting go of your little I is kind of like as difficult as jumping over your own shadow. Try it sometime. It doesn't work very well. I believe that surrender only happens when you find that you're in a situation that you cannot resolve. You are stuck, you're up against the wall. And there's no way you're going to budge that wall. And there's no way that you're going to you have that ability to make the wall move, and you're just screwed. And I've been there a couple of times. And that is the point where you stop, you look back and you say, God, help me through this. And only when I realize my little I isn't capable of getting me through this, am I going to give it up and start looking for something else. And if I surrender to that which is higher than myself, then I find that key that I found floating on the top of the water on a piece of paper. It kind of reminds me of Luke Skywalker when he was, of course, everything reminds me of Star Wars. But anyway, Luke Skywalker, remember when he was trying to overcome the evil empire and he realized he couldn't do it. It was impossible. It was beyond his power. And so what did not Yoda, but come on. No, the good one. Obi-Wan Kenobi. Thank you. Obi-Wan Kenobi. What did Obi-Wan Kenobi kept saying to Luke? Trust the Force, surrender to the Force. And I'm not going to surrender this. I'm just going to clip it right back on there. There we go. Stay there real nice. Okay. Yeah. And he learned that when he was able to let go of his individual self, true power and true calm overtook him. And the power you discover in those moments, it feels so right. It feels so natural. You wonder why you didn't do it in the first place. That always crosses my mind. You know, the one that really kills me is if I've got a situation coming up and it's difficult and I'm going through it and I'm worried, you know, and I might get cranky and I'm like, how's this ever going to work out? And I'm all sweating bullets and everything. And then I get through to the end and it's like, oh, wow, that turned out just the way it was supposed to be. And I'm like, why didn't I recognize that back here? You know, instead of have to go through all this crap to get to the end. Every time. And I've still not gotten to the point where I don't go through that. It just drives me crazy. It's the journey. And it's the journey that I needed to go through to get there 500 times in a row. The first time we develop that kind of surrender, it's really earth-shattering, it's earth-shaking. But it's never a once and for all thing. We never stay at the point of surrender. We are human beings and we tend to backslide and go back to the little I again and try to retake all that stuff that we've given up. And the reason is pretty simple. That's just we're human. That's why we're here on this planet, to keep walking that path upward again until we build our spiritual muscles over and over again. And I think it's somehow in our cellular memory that we cling to worry and stress and fear, and all that stuff tends to raise its ugly head over and over again. And that's just the dragon that we have to fight over and over again. We don't ever seem to kill it, it seems like. The struggles of life and the little I really would prefer that we just forgot about all this surrender stuff so that little I could take over again. I don't have to go through the litany of all the pain that you experience once you give the little I power again, but it's usually significant enough to make me realize I don't want this another time. I used to call it self-will run riot. Yep, you know, I've been there once or twice. 3, 4, 10, 15 times. The best that the ego thinks that surrender means is that I will partially give in while holding on to a personal agenda that I can later bargain with God about. Like, if I surrender this now, then God's going to be happy with me so that later I can go to God and say, now can I have this? I do that a lot, you know, and I'm sure God isn't all upset about it. He's probably up there chuckling and going, yeah, right. You know, has he really surrendered? No, he really hasn't. And real surrender means that I let all of my expectations fall away. that I trust that what will happen is what is meant to happen. That's most likely to happen if I finally arrive at the point where I desperately ask God to take over because there's really nothing else that I can do. And I run into those situations periodically, where I'm just stuck and I just have to trust. How many of you heard the phrase in New Thought communities that says, where people say, I am God, I am God? Yeah, they say, I am God. Hear it all the time. We talked about that in one of our little groups. Yeah, we hear that a lot. And I was always been curious, does that really mean that I am all of God? That I myself am the absolute, the creator? I am the source of the Big Bang myself. I just kind of exploded at some point and poof, everything existed. And, if that's the case, then there's no possibility of surrender, because why would I surrender to myself? I mean, what's the point? I know in my heart, there's a real clear desire to be that polished window through which the divine can shine, enabling me to project my own unique wavelength into the world. And I am unique. I am unrepeatable. We all are. I am a necessary frequency in the divine symphony. Without it, the music goes flat. Why? Because that one piece is missing. That's absolutely essential, and that's you. And God doesn't want to take you away. He wants to work through you as you are, with all your flaws, all your mistakes. And in the process, you're going to grow. But he's not judging those flaws. He wants to work through you as you are. I am blessed to be a co-creator who manifests the power and the grace of God. If I surrender that little ego, if I let it go, then I can do it better. I can't say I won't be able to do it at all if I don't surrender my little ego. And the reason is because we never do completely. It's like that, if you on the Tuesday night group, it's like that rock in the middle of the creek that's our samskara, our what would be quick word, our old weaknesses, our old brokenness. It never completely goes away, but God can work through us better if we do. Otherwise, he works around that. We're not condemned simply by not being perfect. Surrender is the goal. I don't know anyone who's done it completely and perfectly. Utter peace is the end result. All my worries and busyness, they become insignificant when I surrender. You'll know that everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be at this moment, and nothing can truly, truly be wrong. Even those things that are painful. You feel not so much as if you have a life when you surrender, you feel suddenly as if you are life, flowing in this universe, going exactly where it's meant to be. Surrender means letting go of everything you thought yourself to be and letting life itself express itself through you. Gary Zukav, am I pronouncing that name right? Zukav, whatever, there he is. Gary Zukav said in The Seat of the Soul, take your hands off the steering wheel. Said, be able to say to the universe, thy will be done, and allow life to come completely through the hands of the divine source. Wow. That sounds like really good advice, doesn't it? Sounds like something I would really like to do. And maybe here at Spiritual Light Center, we can help one another achieve that.